Hello, I'm Sara Stevenson, a speaker at OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. And I'm really delighted to be joined by Max Baker-Hytch, who's a lecturer in philosophy at Wycliffe Hall at the University of Oxford. So Max, welcome to the studio here at OCCA. Congratulations on writing your first book, God and the Problem of Evidential Ambiguity. So if we could maybe reframe that title to say, The Searcher Looking for Truth.
Right.
Would you feel that that's representative of why you have written this book?
Yeah, I think that's a very key theme in the book. And I feel that, so in my field, philosophy of religion, that's the area I mainly specialize and work in. That there is a huge amount of discussion and of papers and books written on questions like, how good are the arguments for God's existence? How strong is the problem of evil as evidence against God? But what there is very little of is discussion of how the person who wants to find out the truth about these big questions should go about doing that. Should you rely on religious experiences? Should you only consider arguments and try and sit back dispassionately? Should it be a mixture? There's not really a great deal on that question. And so it seems to me that that's something that's worth thinking about. And I think it's something that people care about, whether or not they've studied philosophy. And I think that we have these two kind of data points that we need to wrestle with. And I'm trying in some way to hold them in tension. And one is that when we think about these big questions, whether there's a God, what God might be like, and so on, there's a lot of disagreement. And it seems like smart people can be found on all different sides of the debate. And you could say, in a word, that there's a good amount of ambiguity, right? On the other hand, I want to say, and I think quite a lot of people want to say, that it is possible to land on reasonable conclusions, to come to answers about these big questions. And so somehow I'm trying to hold these two things in tension in this book.
So there's a clarification about how you investigate truth, and also a clarification of the different kinds of people who try to provide a worldview, you could say, to that, which we'll get to. J.L. Schellenberg is a philosopher of religion that's probably most famous for saying something along the lines that there are searchers for truth who can't be blamed for the fog that you've described. So they're searching for truth, they're looking for God, and they can't find him, and there is this fog. And so because they're not deliberately resisting truth or God, that in itself is strong evidence that God doesn't exist. So to what extent do you think this book is a rebuttal to someone like Schellenberg?
Yeah, so I do, in the last chapter of the book, talk a little bit about that issue of whether the fog, as you put it, I think that's a good image, whether the fact that our world has this fog, is that really strong evidence against the existence of God? And I end up suggesting in chapter 5 that actually it's not, it is some evidence, but it's not really strong evidence, that actually there are some reasons to expect fog if God exists. But I think relatedly though, Schellenberg talks about how when he was formulating this argument against God's existence, which you just described, and which he calls the argument from divine hiddenness, he talks about how he had initially started out in his academic journey, trying to think about the ambiguity in the world and try to pin it down and give and come up with a way of describing that ambiguity, that fog, and what does it consist in exactly. And he basically says that he ended up thinking that wasn't a fruitful project. He gave up on it. And he instead just went over to framing this argument in terms of, well, there are people who doubt God's existence and it doesn't seem to be their fault. And that's strong evidence against God. And I basically wanted to say that first thing he was interested in, how do we describe the fog? What is the fog? That he moved on from and didn't pursue in the end. That's partly what I'm trying to engage with in this book.
So it's a part rebuttal or response to Schellenberg,
Yeah.
but then also, as we framed it, a helpful guide to how you navigate that investigation.
Yeah, exactly.
So there is all different kinds of searchers looking for truth amidst the question that you have posed. Who do you think is the primary audience for the content?
Yeah, so the book is written first and foremost, I guess, for my colleagues in philosophy of religion. And so the book does have some more technical aspects to it. But I hope that I've written it in a way that it's still somewhat accessible to people who are interested in these questions about God, religious belief and so on, and who are willing to put a bit of work in. And to that end, I have tried to write it so that, you know, when there's technical terminology, I've tried my best to explain it in as clear a way as possible and to use analogies and that sort of thing.
Yes, and as someone who's teaching apologetics, I can see that there's a technicality to the discussion that you have that is for the philosopher, but I did find it helpful hearing how you frame the problem. Some of the words that you use and the illustrations that you make were really helpful. But it might be interesting for those of us in apologetics to hear, why is the more technical philosophical approach also actually helpful for apologetics?
Yeah, well, so analytic philosophy is the type of philosophy that I've been trained in. Analytic philosophy is, I guess, a methodology, I suppose, or an approach that emphasizes sort of real attempt to be very precise about the meanings of the words we're using, to try and lay out arguments as clearly as possible with, you know, step one, step two, you know, that kind of thing. And to be very, you could say nitpicky, but I do think that is a very useful tool for apologetics, because at the end of the day, the ability to kind of examine a position really carefully and to find inconsistencies in it, to find points of vulnerability, but also to be honest about your own position and to be able to see where those points of vulnerability are there for you as well. But I do think that it's certainly not the only tool that apologists should be drawing on. I think the arts, the imagination are hugely important, but I do think the analytic philosophy toolkit's a valuable one.
Thank you, Max. I think I would like to do a bit of a deeper dive into the problem that you're trying to engage with. And that's this phrase, evidential ambiguity.
Yes.
So what do you mean by that? Because that really is the problem that you then go to address.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So I think I could put it like this, that evidential ambiguity is the fogginess, if you like, that the seeker for truth encounters in their pursuit of the truth. So yeah, evidential ambiguity is the way in which you've got a set of evidence and you're trying to answer a particular question, such as, does God exist? And there's some sense in which that evidence, whilst it may point in a certain direction, and indeed I do want to say that it does point in a certain direction, but nonetheless, it's somehow less than clear cut. There's some room for doubt, if you like. So I think that's how I would characterize it.
That's helpful. And whenever there's doubt, that's when we have worldviews that come in and try to provide solutions.
Yes.
And in the start of your book, you lay a roadmap for those worldviews that you aim to have a truth claim.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could lay out that roadmap for us.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So the word worldview obviously is one that is becoming more commonly used these days. And it is a word that philosophers of religion use, and I think it's a helpful one. It's because the word religion tends to connote belief systems that specifically have some kind of deity. Not always, okay, but mostly. Whereas I think worldview is helpful because it can encompass that, but also pictures of reality that don't have any kind of deity. So yeah, in terms of, so I think worldviews are attempts to answer a set of questions about what is ultimate. So what is the ultimate explanation of the universe? What is ultimately valuable? is there any kind of ultimate destiny for humans beyond death? I would suggest that a worldview is basically any system of beliefs that is a purported answer to those sorts of questions. So yeah, I think we can loosely, and I say this very cautiously because it is a bit rough and ready, but I think we can loosely group worldviews into three families, if you like. So the first one is going to be theistic worldviews, which are characterized by the belief that ultimate reality is personal. So whatever is at the foundations, it's a person. Of course, Christianity and Islam would be versions of that. The second family of worldviews would be naturalistic worldviews that say that the foundation of reality is impersonal, and it's not just impersonal, it's not conscious either. It doesn't have any goals or aims or anything like that. And that's obviously a pretty familiar way of thinking about reality. It's a prevalent approach in the West, of course. But then there's a third category that's a little bit amorphous and slightly awkward because it's trying to lump together a lot of stuff that's potentially quite diverse, but what I call non-naturalistic, non-theistic worldviews. So these are views of reality that say that the foundation is not a personal God, but nor is it mass energy. So an example of this might be Advaita Vedanta, which is a school of Hindu philosophy, that roughly says that ultimate reality is pure consciousness, but it's not quite right to say that it's a personal deity. That would be one example of that third category.
That's helpful. And would you say that the kinds of evidence that you're engaging with in your book is the kind of evidence available to everybody on the planet versus some level of revelation that might be unique to those communities?
Yeah, I think that's right, broadly speaking, though with the caveat that obviously, the extent to which someone has access to what you could call the public evidence is still going to depend on how fortunate they are to have a certain kind of education and that sort of thing. But that's right. So what I was setting out to do was to think about a particular kind of reference point that is something that we share in common. So this is not at all to dismiss the value of religious experience, but it's rather to focus on what is the sort of data that we can all sort of put in the middle of the table, as it were, and we can all agree roughly that's the data that we've got to work with.
So we will deep dive further into the investigation of the evidence. But to stay on the problem for now, one of the most helpful things I found in your book was the illustrations that you gave that so very clearly identified that so much about reality is ambiguous. Could you provide one of those examples?
Yeah, so one of the examples I give is the question of whether there's extraterrestrial intelligence out there. And this seems to me, at least, to be a really clear-cut case of evidential ambiguity. And what I say is that there seem to be three factors that come together to give rise to this ambiguous situation. One of them is kind of how good are our cognitive abilities, our five senses, the minds that we have to be able to process the data that comes in through the senses and so on. So it seems like we're pretty constrained in that way. We can only see as far into space as our telescopes and our radio telescopes will allow us to do. And also we've got the constraint of the speed of light to work with. That's one thing. Another thing is our vantage point, where we're standing, as it were. But that could be broader than just where we're physically located, although it includes that. So in the case of the ET question, we're confined to one little planet in one sort of corner, as it were, of the Milky Way galaxy. So we don't have a kind of omnipresent, ability to see what's going on at all places in the universe. So that's another thing. And then the third thing is the facts of the matter themselves. So let's just suppose for a second there is ET out there, but that it's in another galaxy far away from our own one. And that also makes it more difficult for us to get to the truth of the matter. Whereas if ET was in the next solar system, it would be a lot easier for us to come to a definitive answer to that question.
And how comparative do you think this illustration is for those searching for ultimate truth? Is there a God? What is the nature of our universe? How comparative is the ET question to that?
Well, I think it's possibly... I think actually the ET one may be even more ambiguous than the question about God. But I do think those three factors can helpfully lead us to sort of think about, okay, what is it about our situation that seems to make it difficult to get to the truth about these ultimate questions? So our cognitive faculties, the minds we have, seem to be quite limited in various ways. Our vantage point, where we're standing, as it were. And as I said, I don't think that's just a matter of our physical location. It could also be to do with our kind of moral vantage point, the extent to which we're sort of open to certain types of evidence, certain types of experiences. So yeah, I think at least thinking about examples like ET can help us to identify what might be some of the factors we could look for when it comes to the God question.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So if we call it then ambiguity is the fog, we can't see clearly to the truth. And you've helpfully said in your book, there is an investigation that we all can go on, which you call the public evidence. Right. So maybe we could press further into that. You describe that as all human beings have a shared point of reference.
Right.
So could you maybe give examples of what you mean by that?
Yeah. So the shared frame of reference is basically the data, the set of facts that we can, broadly speaking, all access by way of cognitive abilities, by which I mean the five senses, our abilities to reason. Cognitive abilities that are sort of, broadly speaking, uncontroversial. Everyone would accept them, as opposed to, let's say, clairvoyance or telepathy, which is more controversial. So the set of facts that we can, broadly speaking, all access through these ordinary ways of knowing. So what might be some of the things that we find in that sort of common pool of evidence? So yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be things like the fine-tuning of the universe, those sort of facts that seem to be largely agreed upon by contemporary physicists. How you explain them is a different question. To do with the sort of fragility of the universe's properties in terms of them having to be sort of just right for life. But it's also going to include facts about widespread suffering in the world. I think it's going to include the fact that there is such a thing as consciousness. There's something it's like to experience pain. There's something it's like to see red, to taste coffee. The fact that there aren't just inanimate objects like tables and chairs that don't have a point of view, have no feelings, but that there are, it turns out, conscious beings who, and that seems like a striking fact about our world. So I think also the sort of the way in which our universe appears to be governed by laws of nature, that's interesting as well. There's going to be all sorts of facts having to do with reports of religious experiences. And to be clear, I know I said earlier we're sort of somewhat bracketing out religious experiences. In a sense we are, but we can include in the shared pool of evidence that there are reports of religious, because that's a public fact, if you see what I mean. So yeah, those would be some of the things that would be included there, I think.
So some of those examples you're giving, you could say are empirical evidences versus personal subjective experiences, which maybe is hinting at truth is not just theoretical. So I liked that in your book you drew out some philosophers' approaches that it's not just on facts.
Right.
What else can the searcher do to grapple with truth?
Yeah, so basically, in the fourth chapter of the book, I distinguish two broad families of approaches to the question. basically of how should we seek truth about these big questions. And I called them, for want of sort of a better term, the involved approach and the detached approach. And hopefully people will kind of resonate with these two approaches. Necessarily they're a little bit caricatured, but I think they get at something. So the involved approach sort of advises you to jump feet first into a particular spiritual or religious tradition, commit to it, act as if it's true, open yourself up to experiencing the world through the eyes of this particular tradition. And in a sense, don't even try to take this kind of impartial and objective vantage point. Just dive in and commit. And the claim there is that only by doing that will you be able to get the best evidence. There's some insights that you just can't get by sitting back coolly and impartially. You have to get stuck in.
But you do recognize the caution as to why some people don't want to
Yes,
step inside.
Absolutely. And so I contrast that with another approach, which I think is one that appeals perhaps especially to people with a certain temperament, and maybe I'm more like that. At least the aspiration is to sit back in a more detached way and to have some kind of framework for trying to say, this bit of evidence weighs this much, as it were. This bit of evidence weighs this much, and I want to try and add it all up in a sort of impartial a way as possible. And I call this the detached approach.
So could we say then that the personality type that's not emotional, if they are the analytic thinker, are you saying that unless they themselves move towards a different line of inquiry, it's likely they're going to always remain outsiders?
Yeah, so essentially what I try and do is give a third way between these two, the involved and the detached. So I have sort of critiques for both of them. So the involved approach, on the one hand, I want to recognize that particularly if God exists, and remember, as I said, what that will mean is that ultimate reality is personal. And it seems like there are certain methods for seeking truth about persons that are just different. We have to use different methods than when we're seeking truth merely about objects, or merely about facts, as it were. So, put it like this: I could hire a private investigator to investigate you and find out a huge long list of facts about you. That would be sort of the detached approach, but I won't get to know you personally without actually speaking to you and having some kind of two-way interaction. So if ultimate reality is personal, it seems like the involved approach has to be kind of at least partly right. It looks like we're going to need that sort of approach to some degree to get to have the fullest picture of things. But the caution there is the involved approach doesn't seem to give you any helpful guidance on how to pick which tradition, which worldview to dive in feet first to, right?
So you're humbly suggesting if God is relational and there's elements of a worldview that are relational with others, that the theoretical, analytical has to be met with that relational side. Absolutely.
That's right. And the caution with the detached approach, as you said, the sort of analytical posture, is that the attempt to sort of come up with some sort of algorithm, if you like, and whereby we can say this bit of evidence has this much weight, this one has this much, and let's add it all up. The philosopher Robert McKim puts it like this, that this has been attempted many times in philosophy of religion, and as he puts it, when has there ever been an example of someone who goes through this procedure and comes up with an answer that was different from the one they started out with? So that's the worry, that it's inevitably going to be biased and coloured. The attempt to add things up is not going to be as impartial as you want it to be, and it's inevitably going to be coloured by the impressions that you had at the start, the kind of big picture instincts that you had to start with.
So to take this in a new direction, I often find that the pushback to the theistic worldview approach is the problem of evil. So classically, that's always looked like if there was a loving God to exist, it's very improbable given the kind of universe that we're in, where there is lots of suffering. So I suppose my question to you, given your research for this, is how much does the divine hiddenness problem add a new layer to that? Again, what we mean by divine hiddenness is it seems very foggy when some people try to connect to the divine, that they just feel a lack of his presence.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So I think what I want to say there is that the problem of evil and the problem of divine hiddenness, if you like, the problem of why isn't God more obvious, I see those as being distinct. I don't think the problem of divine hiddenness is just kind of part of the problem of evil. So to flesh that out a bit, I think you can imagine in principle there being a world that has evil and suffering like our world does, but in which God is, God has written in the stars, or he's speaking in an audible booming voice that everyone around the globe can hear simultaneously. So that would be a world where there's evil but no hiddenness. So it does seem in principle like they are slightly separate problems. However, something I do try and say towards the end of the book is that if there are reasons, if God exists and has reasons to allow evil, and I don't argue for that as such in the book, but it's a hypothetical, if that's the case, then it seems quite likely that the world is going to have a good deal of fog, as you put it. There's going to be a good deal of ambiguity. And why is that? Well, one reason for that is simply that the existence of widespread suffering in our world is one of the biggest sources of counter-evidence against the existence of God, right? So if we want to say there's evidence for the existence of God, the existence of evil and suffering by many people's reckoning is the most powerful piece of counter-evidence against that. So the very right, and so that in itself gives rise to some degree of fogginess. But then in addition to that, something I try to develop is the thought that, okay, again, we're working with this hypothetical. If God exists and has reasons to allow suffering, then fogginess is quite likely. And a reason for thinking that is that, one of the main kind of theodicies that's been given, one of the sort of main stories that attempts to outline some of the possible reasons God might have for allowing suffering, is what's known as the soul-making theodicy. So the idea being that only in a world with adversity, danger, scarcity, and so on, can we have opportunities to be courageous, to be generous, to be, to be patient, and this kind of thing, and to develop our characters by gaining these virtues. And the thought is that if God was too obvious, then that kind of soul-making process would be inhibited. If we always saw, if God's existence was very obvious and we could see that, yeah, this is what's going on, God is trying to give us opportunities to cultivate courage and so on. Actually, the process wouldn't work very well. Whereas if there's some distance between us and God, if there's some fog, let's say, that makes it that much more possible for us to exercise these virtues in the face of adversity. And so that's a reason for thinking that if God exists and has reasons to allow suffering, you can expect a good degree of fogginess.
So you aren't arguing explicitly for God's existence or a theistic worldview.
That's right.
But you could say that there's a partial rebuttal to Schellenberg on the grounds that it's not irrational to have come to the conclusion that God exists.
Yeah, that's right. And I think more than anything, the book is trying to say that the mere fact that there's ambiguity, there's disagreement, and so on, doesn't shut down the possibility of making a cumulative case for the existence of God. So in a sense, you could say that it's clearing space for that conversation to happen.
And that does lead me then to What would you love the outcome of this book to be in this discussion? It's not an apologetics book. You're not trying to slam dunk an argument for God's existence. So what are you hoping to achieve?
Well, I think one of in a sense, chapter 4, where I talk about these different approaches to seeking truth, has perhaps the most practical application. So as I said, the detached approach, the involved approach, and I kind of have critiques for both of them. And I think where I want to land with that, and hopefully something people can take away from this, is that I think it is possible to seek truth and come to reasonable conclusions. And I think there is a sort of third way between that detached approach that attempts to almost use a mathematical algorithm to work out what's the answer, versus this sort of just dive in feet first and don't pay attention to the evidence.
So there is different kinds of evidence and not just empirical.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the work of Iain McGilchrist can be really helpful. So Iain McGilchrist is a psychiatrist and philosopher, and he's done some really careful work looking at the way that the left hemisphere of the brain basically likes to focus on the small details. It likes to break problems down into little bits, and it likes very definite solutions, and it can be quite reductive. Whereas the right hemisphere...
Like the philosopher.
Well, an analytic philosophy definitely can veer into that overemphasis on the left hemisphere. But the right hemisphere, he thinks, which especially in Western culture, he thinks have been trained to neglect too much, the right hemisphere. But the right hemisphere is very good at stepping back from the canvas and taking a big picture view and grasping narrative and meaning and metaphor and things that are often hard to put into words, things that are a bit intangible. And so what I want to suggest is that we can take an approach that properly is about engaging with evidence, but also recognizes that it's legitimate to step back and pay attention to those intuitions about the whole canvas. So, for example, if I'm in an art gallery looking at a beautiful work of art, and I'm asked to sort of give an evaluation of it, it would be a weird approach to sort of take a picture of it on my camera and then dice it up into 100 squares and then look at each of them. And the use of light and dark is really good there. The mixture of colors is really nice there. And then my judgment on the whole painting is going to be the result of trying to add up all of those little judgments. That would be a very odd way to do it. The way we would normally do it is to step back from the canvas, and we have a judgment about the whole thing, which I want to suggest is not reducible to the judgments if I were to do those 100 little squares. And so that's basically what I want to say about the quest for truth, about these big questions, is that it's legitimate to take that big picture view that pays attention to those kind of right hemisphere ways of thinking.
So there's a note of caution, I think, for the skeptic that's maybe unwilling to engage with other kinds of evidence, but perhaps you also might like to leave us at OCCA with maybe some advice on how can apologetics also take a note of caution in the question?
Well, I think, I'll give two things. So one, I think, is that people who are, I think, sensitive to these sorts of issues, even if they haven't formally studied philosophy, they are mindful of the fact that there are a lot of options on the table when it comes to worldviews. And to present the case for Christianity as if it's just a really clear cut, it's just so obviously, overwhelmingly evident. I think that that's not going to be very compelling to the sort of person that I have in mind here. So I think a certain kind of humble confidence, if I can put it that way, I think is probably a helpful approach there. Which is to say a sense that, that there is a strong cumulative case to be built here, but I think we should acknowledge that there are parts of the picture, the pool of evidence that we've put in the middle of the table. There are parts of it that do seem to point in the other direction if you take them on their own. So I think a willingness to acknowledge that is important. And the other thing I would say is, going back to this thing about left hemisphere, right hemisphere, or detached approach and involved approach, I think apologetics should really strive to have a healthy balance of those approaches. And you can see how often apologetics, I think, often has fallen into a very left-brained approach. And perhaps that's understandable, because there was a sense from the new atheists in the early 2000s that belief in God has nothing in its favor when we think in these sort of analytical, philosophical ways. And so it was understandable that there would be a response to that. But I don't think we want to say that's the only way to make the case for Christianity. I think the importance of the imagination, the arts, and C.S. Lewis, I think, recognized this. He did do some of the sort of left hemisphere approach, especially in his earlier work. But then, he was very alive to the importance of the imagination and the sort of power of making people want Christianity to be true, as it were.
Yes, these two things did strike me in your book. You were reminding those of us who are in the involved worldview of theism to remember the fog that is some people's experience and how they are seeing things, which is so helpful. And the second thing is that it's not just logical arguments that may persuade them to move, but actually experiences, story, narrative also does become quite apparent. So Max, it's been so good to have you in the studio today. Congratulations again on your book. And we do wish you well both in academia and here with us at OCCA as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah.